The courthouse in Hartford smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, sterile, indifferent, almost too clean for a place where lives unraveled daily. Margaret Stevens sat alone on the wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, her hands resting in her lap. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold draft that crept under the door. At 61, she'd learned how to brace herself for the cold, both the physical kind and the one that settled in after a funeral, after everyone went home, and after a family turned its back on you like you were never really there. Her late husband, Robert Stevens, had died 3 months earlier, a heart attack in his sleep. No warning. One moment, they were arguing about the dry cleaning bill. The next morning, she woke up next to a body that would never speak again. It took her hours to call the ambulance. Not because she was in denial, but because something in her knew what was coming next. She could still hear the phone call from Robert's daughter, Colleen. "Margaret, we need you to move out of the house by Friday. It's not yours, and Dad never added you to the will. You were just his nurse, really." Margaret didn't reply. She simply hung up, walked into Robert's study, and opened the top drawer, the one with the manila folder she knew was there now. 3 months later, she waited to be called into a courtroom that felt more like a firing squad. The Stevens family had arrived 15 minutes late, ushered in by their high-priced attorney in a navy suit, whispering and shaking heads. No one looked at her. No one had since the funeral. Case number 0483, in re. The estate of Robert W. Stevens, the clerk called. Margaret stood. Her shoes, sensible and old, echoed softly on the linoleum floor. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. A few reporters, maybe a curious clerk, and 3 rows of people who'd always resented her for reasons unspoken. The judge was a tall man in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and a schedule to keep. He barely glanced at her as she approached. "The plaintiff's table, Miss Stevens," he said dryly. "You may begin." She opened her mouth to speak, but Colleen's lawyer interrupted immediately. "Your Honor, we'd like to make this simple. There is no legal proof that Miss Stevens has any rightful claim to Mr. Stevens' estate. She was never added to the will. She was not listed as a beneficiary. We are asking the court to recognize this and close the matter." The judge turned to Margaret. "Do you have any documentation to prove a legal union with Mr. Stevens?" She began. He cut her off. "Because if not, there's really no need to prolong this. As it stands, you don't own anything here." The words rang out like a bell, loud, final. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed. Another person muttered, "Figures." Margaret's hands began to shake. But only for a moment. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old, yellowed envelope. Carefully, deliberately, she walked to the clerk's table and placed it down. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is our marriage contract. Signed in Vermont. Notarized. Filed, though never shared, at Robert's request. He wanted privacy. I honored that. Until now." The judge picked it up with visible reluctance, as if half expecting it to be meaningless. But as his eyes scanned the document, his posture changed. His brow furrowed. He flipped the pages once, then again. Silence fell. "The kind that doesn't invite breath. You were married," he muttered, more to himself than to the room. "Legally." Margaret didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply returned to her seat and folded her hands once again. The Stevens family began to whisper loudly, their voices rising in disbelief and frustration. "She's lying. That can't be. He would have told us." The judge raised his hand for silence. His expression was unreadable now, caught somewhere between surprise and discomfort. "This changes things significantly," he said. "We'll need to recess to review." Margaret looked ahead, calm, unflinching. The truth had sat in her purse for 3 months. Now it was on the table. And for the first time since Robert died, she felt the weight begin to shift. Court was adjourned for a 40-minute recess, but Margaret didn't move. She sat quietly on the bench outside the courtroom, her coat still folded over her lap like armor. Across the hall, the Stevens family huddled with their attorney, their voices low but taut with panic. Inside, behind the heavy oak doors, the judge and court clerk reviewed the contract, page by page, signature by signature. Every moment felt suspended. Margaret watched the hallway clock tick forward. Each minute wasn't just time, it was memory. 11 years of it. She remembered the day Robert proposed. It wasn't grand, no ring, no candles, just a moment at the kitchen sink when he turned to her and said, "I want you to have the rights people think you already do." It had been 5 years since his wife had passed, and Robert, then nearing retirement, had spent months fending off family pressures to stay single, to keep things clean, as Colleen once put it. But clean had always meant convenient. And Margaret was never convenient. They had driven to Vermont quietly, just the two of them, under the guise of a long weekend. The justice of the peace wore a wrinkled shirt and smelled faintly of tobacco. The whole ceremony took 12 minutes. They had laughed on the way out, and then, they kept it private, not a secret, exactly, but quiet. Robert said it was for peace. Margaret knew it was for control. He feared what Colleen and the others would do if they knew Margaret was now legally family. "They'll fight over my socks when I die," he had once joked. "I don't want them fighting over you." Now, they were doing exactly that. The courtroom door opened sharply. The bailiff nodded toward her. "Miss Stevens. Judge wants you back in." Margaret stood slowly, her knees stiff. The hallway felt warmer now, or maybe it was her heart beating hard enough to generate its own heat. She walked past the Stevens family without a glance. Only one pair of eyes met hers, Colleen's. Cold, red-rimmed, threatening. Inside, the judge no longer looked bored. His gaze followed her as she returned to the table. "I've reviewed the marriage contract thoroughly," he began. "It is legally binding. There's no ambiguity in the language. You were married to Robert Stevens at the time of his death, and thus, you are his surviving spouse." The words hung like a hammer about to drop. "That status affords you certain rights under Connecticut law, including, but not limited to, elective share provisions of his estate, regardless of what is or isn't in the will." A murmur rose from the gallery. The Stevens attorney looked stunned. Margaret didn't move. The judge turned to Colleen's side. "Do you wish to contest the authenticity of the marriage contract?" Her attorney stood. "Your Honor, given the recent presentation of the document, we'd like time to validate its authenticity independently. This could have been doctored." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Be very careful with that accusation." He turned back to Margaret. "Do you have any additional documents, Miss Stevens, that support your marriage? Photographs, mail, shared property receipts?" Margaret reached back into her purse. She had prepared for this moment like a nurse preps for a critical procedure, with precision, with care. She laid out a stack of documents, a joint tax return, health insurance records, a photo of them outside the Vermont courthouse, smiling in the snow, a letter from Robert to the IRS declaring her as his spouse. The judge examined them quickly. "This is more than sufficient." He turned to the courtroom again. "As of this moment, Ms. Margaret Stevens is recognized as the legal widow of Robert Stevens, with all attendant rights." Colleen let out a sharp, guttural sound, not quite a cry, not quite a protest. It was the sound of disbelief meeting reality. The judge added, "I suggest mediation unless the family wishes to proceed with a formal contest, which could prove costly." Margaret finally spoke. "I'm not here to take everything. I never was. I just won't be erased." The judge didn't reply, but there was a softness in his expression now, not sympathy, but respect. Court adjourned. Margaret walked slowly toward the hallway again. She could feel every eye on her back, every whisper trying to rewrite the story they thought they knew. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. She wrapped her coat tighter, her fingers brushing the lining where a folded note still rested. Robert's last letter to her, written 2 weeks before he died. She hadn't opened it yet. The cab ride back to the house was quiet. Margaret sat with her hands folded over her purse, the city's summer sun slanting through the window and washing her face in gold. It made the fine lines around her eyes seem softer, though her jaw remained tight. The driver didn't make small talk, and she was grateful. She needed the silence, needed to breathe without having to explain herself. As the car turned off Main Street and wound through the tree-lined avenues of Hartford's west side, Margaret looked out at the homes, colonials with manicured hedges, porches with rocking chairs, the occasional flag flapping gently in the breeze. Robert had always liked this neighborhood, not too loud, not too quiet. He used to say they had lived in the same house for 9 years. But in all that time, Margaret had never felt like it truly belonged to her. She didn't choose the paint color. She didn't plant the garden. She didn't even have her name on the mailbox. That had been a fight once. Robert promised to fix it. He never did. Now, her name would be on far more than the mailbox. The cab pulled into the driveway. The house stood 2 stories tall, brick-fronted, with ivy creeping up the side. It looked unchanged, but everything about it felt different. As she stepped out and handed the driver a 20, she noticed the front window curtain twitch slightly. Someone was inside. Her stomach tensed. She climbed the steps slowly and unlocked the doors. Inside, the air was thick, humid from the afternoon sun and stale with tension. In the living room, seated on the couch like she had been waiting for hours, was Colleen. "How did you get in?" Margaret asked, not raising her voice. "I still have a key," Colleen said coolly. "It used to be my house too, remember?" Margaret didn't respond. She placed her purse on the entry table, keeping her eyes on Colleen. "You really had a marriage certificate," Colleen said after a moment. "A real one?" Margaret nodded. "You kept it from all of us." "It was Robert's choice," Margaret said. "He didn't want the fight. He said it would destroy whatever little relationship he had left with you. Colleen scoffed. That's rich. You think you're the victim here? I didn't say I was. You waited. You waited until he was dead, and then you pulled it out like some legal trap. Margaret's voice stayed even. No. I waited until you tried to erase me. Colleen stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. You think this changes anything? You think a piece of paper makes you family? We barely knew you. You sat at dinners like a guest. Dad never brought you to holidays. You think that makes you a wife? Margaret's voice cracked, but only slightly. I was the one who found him. Not you. I was the one who called the ambulance. Who handled the burial. Who sorted his pills, calmed his tremors, listened to him talk about his regrets at 2 a.m. She took a breath. You want to talk about being family? I didn't have to be loud about it. I just had to be there. Colleen said nothing. Her fists clenched, then her tone shifted, low, measured, sharp. This isn't over. I never thought it would be, Margaret said. Colleen walked to the door, but before leaving, she turned. You may have fooled the judge, but you didn't fool me. You'll never really belong here. When she slammed the door behind her, the echo lingered like a slap. Margaret stood in the silence for a long time. Then she walked to the couch, sat down, and unzipped the inner pocket of her purse. The letter was still there. Robert had given it to her the day before he died. He was in one of his quiet moods, pensive, heavy-eyed. He'd told her, don't read it now. Read it when you need to remember who you are. Her hands shook as she unfolded the page. The handwriting was unmistakably his, slanted and rushed. Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry for everything I didn't do to protect you from what's coming. I should have told Colleen. I should have stood up louder. But I was tired of fighting with them, and you always deserved more peace than I could give. You were never my nurse. You were never just a caretaker. You were my home. There's a folder. In the study, top drawer, behind the tax files. My letter to the lawyer, explaining everything. My decision. Not yours. Use it if they try to push you out. I know they'll try. I'm sorry I won't be here to see you win. But I believe in you. You always fought with dignity. Fight now, too. Just don't let them make you smaller than you are. Love, Robert. Margaret. Read it twice, then she folded it neatly, placed it back in her purse, and stood. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the hardwood floor. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with summer, kids yelling, lawnmowers humming, wind shaking. The trees inside. Margaret went to the study. She opened the drawer. The drawer gave a slight creak as Margaret pulled it open, a familiar sound that somehow felt foreign now. The study was Robert's sanctuary, a dim, wood-paneled room filled with leather-bound books, old clocks that no longer ticked, and a desk that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and ink. Her fingers slid past the folders in the top drawer, past years of tax returns and clipped utility bills. In the back, wedged behind a thick file labeled Medical 2022, she found a slim, brown envelope. It wasn't marked. Just sealed, yellowing at the corners, and thick with something heavier than paper, gravity. She hesitated. Then opened it. Inside were 3 pages, a signed letter addressed to Robert's estate attorney. A handwritten inventory of assets, stocks, savings, real estate, with Margaret's name next to the items marked, to be protected. A copy of the revised will. And signed. The letter began simply, to whom it may concern, I, Robert W. Stevens, am writing to express my full intention that my wife, Margaret Stevens, be protected and recognized as my lawful spouse in the event of my passing. We were married in the state of Vermont on September 12, 2014, and have lived as husband and wife since. I regret that I did not revise my formal will, but the attached documents and this letter should stand as confirmation of my intent. Margaret is entitled to remain in the home we shared, to access the joint accounts, and to retain the property and possessions we built together. She has cared for me not out of obligation but love, the kind few people are lucky enough to find once, let alone twice in a lifetime. To contest her role in my life is to deny the truth of who I was in my final years. Please see that she is respected accordingly. Sincerely, Robert W. Stevens. It wasn't notarized. It didn't have legal weight, not in the way courts liked. But it had Robert's voice. His choice. And his unmistakable handwriting. She laid the letter on the desk gently, almost like setting a photograph on a grave. A wave of exhaustion settled over her. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding everything inside. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since the hearing, she let herself cry, not from sadness, not entirely, but from the slow, burning relief of being seen. Her tears were interrupted by a knock on the door. She wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself. No one ever knocked here. Most of Robert's family wouldn't dare come to the house without a lawyer now. She stepped into the hallway and approached the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, she saw a man, tall, suited, late 40s, holding a briefcase. Not Colleen's lawyer. Someone new. She opened the door cautiously. "Mrs. Stevens?" he asked. "Yes? I'm Daniel Park. I represent Gregory Stanton's firm, the estate attorney named in your late husband's documents. I came as soon as I was notified about today's hearing." She nodded, stepping aside that he entered the foyer with quiet precision, scanning the home like someone used to gauging atmospheres, tension, layout, silence. He looked around, then met her gaze. "Do you mind if I take a look at what you found?" Margaret led him to the study, handed him the letter and the asset inventory. He read in silence for several minutes, then spoke without looking up. "This letter isn't formalized, but it's clear. And if we can verify Robert's signature, which shouldn't be difficult, it will reinforce your claim during the mediation process. Especially paired with the marriage certificate." She nodded again, her throat tight. "His daughter came here today." "Colleen?" "Yes. Told me I'd never belong." Park sighed. "She's desperate. And angry. The court may see that as emotional volatility, which isn't good for her case." Margaret sat in Robert's chair, her fingers tracing the armrest. "I don't want revenge," she said softly. "I just don't want to be erased. I spent more time with him in the last 10 years than any of them did in 20. I don't need their approval. But I won't be told I was nothing." Park regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." He took out a notepad. "We'll prepare a supplementary affidavit. We'll get this letter verified. You'll need to submit a formal claim against the estate before the next court date. It'll be combative. Are you ready for that?" Margaret looked at the framed photo on the shelf, a quiet one from a weekend in Maine, Robert squinting against the sun, his arm around her shoulder. "I buried the man I loved," she said. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Park stood. "I'll be in touch within 2 days. In the meantime, don't talk to Colleen or her lawyers. Let everything go through me." He gave her a card, then left. Margaret remained in the study long after the door closed. The shadows in the room stretched with the late afternoon sun, long and slanted across the bookshelves. She reached for Robert's old planner, the one he insisted on keeping even after switching to digital. On the inside cover, in faded ink, he had scribbled a quote: "In the end, we are remembered not for how loudly we speak, but for how firmly we stand." She closed the planner and stood. Margaret's days began to change. Morning coffee, once made in slow silence, was now sipped while reading legal briefs at the kitchen table. Her walks to the mailbox, once just routine, had become small moments of anticipation, waiting for the next chess move in what her attorney called an aggressive probate strategy. Colleen hadn't spoken to her since the unannounced visit. But Margaret felt her presence constantly, in the way certain neighbors stopped waving, in the new landscaping crew that trimmed the Stevens family plot with surgical care and deliberate glances, in the sudden coldness of the mail carrier who used to chat about his daughter's piano lessons. The air around her shifted, subtly but persistently. On a Tuesday morning, a thick envelope arrived. The return address was a law firm in Stamford, Colleen's new team. Inside was a formal petition to challenge the validity of the marriage contract. The document claimed that Robert had not been of sound mind at the time of signing, citing medical records from a hospitalization 8 months before the wedding. It also included 2 sworn statements from distant cousins who alleged Margaret had controlled Robert and isolated him from his family. Margaret read every line slowly. Once, twice, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She picked up the phone and called Daniel Park. 20 minutes later, he was in her living room, glasses low on his nose, eyes moving rapidly over the papers. "There. Grasping," he said finally. "Those medical records don't indicate cognitive decline, just a stress-induced arrhythmia. And these cousin affidavits? One of them hasn't seen Robert in 8 years." "They're playing dirty," Margaret murmured. Park leaned back. "It's intimidation. They're hoping you'll cave, maybe take a small settlement and walk away." Margaret sat still for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the hallway closet. She returned with a small fireproof lockbox. From it, she pulled out a red notebook. "What's this?" Park asked. "Robert's symptom journal. I kept it for the doctors, but he added his own entries too. Notes, thoughts, even letters. To me, tucked in the margins. Dates. Clarity. Intent. He was never confused. Not once." She opened to a page. September 14th, just married. Cold rain in Vermont. I've never been more certain about anything. Park smiled, a small thing. This could be powerful. The following week, they filed a formal response to the petition, including the marriage certificate, Robert's personal letter, financial documentation, and now the journal. Park submitted a motion to dismiss the challenge as frivolous and defamatory. The court set a hearing date, 3 weeks from Thursday. In the quiet days that followed, Margaret stayed close to home. She began cleaning the house, not out of nervous energy, but out of something deeper. Reclaiming every drawer, every closet. She found things Robert had hidden over the years: a shoebox of love letters from his first wife, an unopened bottle of cologne she had once gifted him, never used. A faded Polaroid of the two of them at a street fair, laughing, his arm around her waist. She didn't keep everything. Some things she gave away. Others she burned. One afternoon, she stood in the backyard, feeding dry paper into the fire pit, a stack of Robert's old business receipts, letters from Colleen full of veiled jabs, even a half-finished birthday card never sent. She watched the pages curl, blacken, and disappear. It wasn't revenge. It was release. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Colleen's side just offered mediation. They want to resolve quickly and privately. Margaret stared at the message, then, after a moment, she typed her reply. Only if they acknowledge the marriage on record. No settlements without truth. That night, she sat by the fireplace, the real one in the den, and pulled out Robert's journal. She flipped to the back, where she remembered him once scribbling a half-finished thought. They won't understand what you gave me, Margaret. But you don't need them to. You were enough. You always were. She pressed her hand to the page. Eyes closed. She wasn't fighting for money, she was fighting for memory. The mediation took place in a private downtown office tower, neutral ground, beige carpets, pale wood furniture, and windows that reflected more of the clouds than the city skyline. It felt like a place designed for forgetting, not remembering. Still, Margaret sat tall, her navy blazer pressed, her silver hair pulled into a clean twist at the nape of her neck. She had prepared. Not just in paper, but in poised. On the other side of the glass table sat Colleen and her attorney, a woman in a charcoal suit with an efficient voice and no interest in small talk. Colleen avoided eye contact, arms crossed tightly, mouth set. In a line that hadn't moved since Margaret arrived, Daniel Park sat beside Margaret, his demeanor calm but alert. He had warned her on the phone the night before, they're going to posture. They'll try to guilt you. But remember, they asked for mediation. That's their first concession. The mediator, a kind-eyed man in his 60s, opened with, "Practice neutrality. We are here to resolve the estate matters of the late Robert W. Stevens, with mutual respect and the hope of avoiding a prolonged court process. Both parties have submitted documentation. Let's begin with asset recognition." Colleen's lawyer went first, a rehearsed list of assets: the house, 2 joint investment accounts, an annuity, and Robert's life insurance policy. Margaret said nothing, then came the claims. Colleen's lawyer pushed forward with a calm venom. "While we acknowledge the presented marriage certificate, we maintain concern regarding the timeline of mental competence. There is evidence Mr. Stevens had begun forgetting things, misplacing documents, and acting inconsistently during the year he allegedly married Ms. Stevens." Margaret looked up. "Allegedly?" The attorney blinked. "Yes. Allegedly, in the sense that no one in the family was made aware of this marriage until after Mr. Stevens's death. That secrecy raises questions." Margaret turned to the mediator. "May I respond?" He nodded. She pulled out the notebook, Robert's journal. It had post-it tabs, color-coded. She opened to a specific page and read aloud, "September 15th. Bought Margaret a small ring. It was her second favorite. First was too expensive, but she smiled like it didn't matter. Married now. Quietly. For us." She turned the page. "October 1st, forgot my keys today. Not memory. Just stress. Margaret worries more than I do. God, I love her." She closed the book gently. He was competent. He was in love. And he was deliberate. Not perfect. But deliberate. Colleen's face tightened, but she still wouldn't speak. Park slid forward a second document. "This is a handwriting verification from a forensic analyst. It confirms Robert's journal and estate letter were written by him. Voluntarily. With clarity." The mediator nodded. "Thank you. That's meaningful." Colleen's attorney adjusted her papers. "Let's discuss proposed division. My client is willing to offer Ms. Stevens the house and a small monthly payout in exchange for withdrawing all other claims." Margaret smiled, but not kindly. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said. "I'm asking for acknowledgement. I want the estate filing corrected to list me as spouse. Legal. Formal. Permanent." Colleen finally spoke, her voice sharp and brittle. "You want to be written in like you were part of the story the whole time." Margaret met her eyes. "I was." Colleen's lip trembled, just a flicker. "He never told me." Margaret didn't respond. She knew there was no winning that argument. You can't measure love by who knew what and when. You can only show up for it. The mediator broke the silence. "Let me suggest a proposal. Miss Stevens retains the house and is listed as surviving spouse in the estate records. Financial assets are divided proportionally. Ms. Stevens withdraws any additional claims against the life insurance policy. Daniel Park leaned in. We can agree to that, if the spousal designation is recorded without conditions. Colleen whispered to her lawyer. A minute passed. Finally, the lawyer nodded. We accept. It wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was recognition. The papers were printed. Signed. Notarized. Margaret left the mediation office without looking back. She stepped into the sunlit plaza, the city air warm and moving around her in gentle waves. Daniel walked beside her for a block, then stopped to take a call. You okay to get home? He asked. She nodded. I think I'll walk a little first. She wandered toward the old art museum where she and Robert once got caught in the rain. The memory came gently, like mist. She remembered how he insisted they stay outside, soaked, just to feel young again. She had laughed and called him a fool, and now she smiled at the steps of that same museum and whispered, You were a fool. But you were mine. And finally, legally, the world had been made to say so too. 2 weeks had passed since the mediation agreement was signed. The paperwork was officially filed. Margaret's name was now recorded as Robert's legal spouse in the state's probate system. She had received a letter from the clerk's office. With the updated designation, a plain government document, barely a few lines long, but to her, it was monumental. Not because it gave her power, but because it restored what they'd tried to strip away, her truth. She sat in the den that afternoon, sorting through boxes Robert had stored in the basement. He was not a sentimental man, but he had kept things, odd, mismatched artifacts from his life before her, a pocket knife from his Boy Scout days, faded postcards from business trips, cassette tapes labeled in uneven block letters. There were folders of client notes from his consulting years, notebooks filled with half-finished to-do lists, and one dusty black box marked simply, private. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were photographs, not from his youth, but from their years together. Candid ones she didn't know existed, her in the garden, smiling unknowingly toward the kitchen window, them seated at a park bench, backs to the camera, hands intertwined, a picture from Vermont, taken by the justice of the peace, where Robert stood beside her looking not just happy, but at ease. She sat with the box in her lap for a long while. It was the first time in months that she felt like Robert had left something for her, not just behind her. Later that evening, she decided to call Robert's old friend, Howard Kessler, a name that had come up more than once in Robert's journals, always with warmth. Howard? This is Margaret. I hope it's not too late. Margaret, came the surprised but pleasant voice on the other end. It's been a long time. I'm sorry I didn't call after the funeral. Well, Colleen told me you two were separate. We weren't, she said gently. We were married. I have the certificate. The court has it now too. A pause. I'll be damned, Howard muttered. He never told me. But that makes sense. He was always protective of things he loved. They talked for an hour. Howard told her stories, small ones. How Robert would brag about Margaret's cooking when she wasn't around. How he once turned down a golf trip to stay home with her after she twisted her ankle. How he kept a photo of them in his desk drawer at work and never let anyone tease him about it. Margaret listened in silence, each story pressing gently against the ache inside her. Before they hung up, Howard said, he may not have said it out loud, but he made it clear, in the ways that mattered. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and wrote her first letter in years, to Robert. She didn't know what she'd do with it. Maybe tuck it into the journal. Maybe burn it. Maybe both. Robert, I'm not sure what you'd think of all this. Part of me believes you'd be proud. Another part thinks you'd be horrified I had to fight it all. You always believed truth should be obvious. But life's messier than that. They tried to erase me. But I'm still here. In this house. At your desk. In your memories, tucked into boxes you thought no one would open. And maybe, just maybe, I'm stronger than I thought I was. Or maybe I was always this strong, and you were the only one who saw it. I miss you. I'm still angry. I'm still grateful. Love, M. She folded the letter and slipped it into an old envelope. No address. Just his name. The following morning, she walked to the community garden Robert used to volunteer at. She hadn't returned since his death. The gate creaked as she opened it, and the scent of tomatoes and basil hit her all at once, bright, fresh, grounding. She knelt near a small plot where Robert once grew sunflowers, and with fingers steady and sure, she buried the letter under the soil, not as a goodbye. As root, something quiet but permanent. As she stood and wiped her hands, an older man in a straw hat passed by and gave her a nod. You knew here, he asked. Margaret smiled. Not really. Just, returning. It was a Friday morning when Margaret heard the knock. Steady. Intentional. She had just finished watering the basil on the windowsill, the scent still clinging to her fingers. She opened the door and found a man in a crisp white shirt holding a clipboard. His ID badge read, Marshal's office. Mrs. Stevens? Yes. I'm here to serve notice. There's a pending claim contesting your continued residence in this property. A lien has been filed by Colleen Stevens and submitted through her legal counsel. Margaret stared at him, breath caught. But we just signed mediation. We settled. I understand. I'm just delivering the notice. You'll need to respond through the court system within 10 days. He handed her the paperwork, a stapled stack of cool, unfeeling language. Then, with a polite nod, he turned and left. Margaret closed the door slowly, the sound of the lock echoing louder than usual in the foyer. Back at the kitchen table, she flipped through the pages. Her hands were steady, but a deep, heavy pressure settled in her chest. Colleen had filed a lien against the house, claiming that Margaret's occupancy violated the spirit of the family's intended settlement, and that full title transfer was not completed at the time of mediation. It was a reach. A legal stunt. But it had weight. She called Daniel Park. He answered immediately. I just got the alert from the court's electronic filing system, he said. She's playing games. She's trying to force me out. She's trying to exhaust you, he corrected. Make you regret fighting. Margaret said nothing. A long pause followed. You still want to go to trial? He asked. No, Margaret said, her voice low. I want to end this. But not by walking away. Daniel exhaled. Okay. Then we respond, not just to dismiss the lien, but to file a counterclaim. Defamation of character, malicious intent, and willful obstruction of a mediated agreement. That'll make her angry, Margaret said. It should, he replied. Over the weekend, Margaret barely left the house. She sorted through more of Robert's documents, found receipts in both their names for furniture, plumbing repairs, even a second mortgage they had paid off together. She added it all to a folder labeled Proof of Partnership. And then, on Sunday evening, something unexpected happened. A knock. Again, she opened the door, cautious, and found Elliot, Robert's grandson, standing nervously on the steps. He was 22, quiet, always more of an observer than a talker. Margaret hadn't seen him since the funeral. Hi, he said awkwardly. Can I come in for a minute? She stepped aside. They sat in the den, the light dim with late afternoon shadows. Elliot looked around like the house had aged. I'm not here for her, he said quickly. My mom doesn't know I came. Margaret folded her hands. Why are you here? Elliot looked down at his shoes. Because I found something in Grandpa's garage. A video. He pulled out a USB drive. It was in a box marked, for Margaret. She must have missed it when we were clearing things after the funeral. Margaret felt her breath catch. Why didn't you bring it before? Because I didn't think you needed me. But I watched it last night. And I think you should have it, especially now. He stood, anxious. I've gotta go. But I'm sorry for what they're doing. And I know you loved him. He did too. He just didn't know how to say it to anyone else. Then he left. Margaret sat alone in the den for a long time, the small plastic drive warm in her palm. Finally, she plugged it into Robert's old laptop. The video opened with a shaky frame, Robert in his study, the fireplace crackling behind him. He looked older than she remembered, but alert. Margaret, I don't know if you'll ever watch this. I don't know if I'll get to tell you everything in person. But just in case I don't, here it is. I know my family will come after you. They've always seen you as an outsider. That's my fault. I should have been louder about what you meant to me. But let me be loud now. You were my wife. You were my partner. You were the only one who stayed when things got hard. When I forgot names. When I lashed out. When I was afraid. This house? It was never a house until you made it one. They want it because they think it means something. But only you gave it meaning. Fight if you have to. But don't forget, you've already won. Because I never doubted you. I love you. The video ended with a pause, Robert reaching to turn off the camera, his hand trembling slightly. Margaret closed the laptop slowly. She wasn't angry. Not in that moment. She was ready. The following Monday, Margaret walked into the courthouse not as someone bracing for impact, but as someone carrying proof. Not just in her hand, but in her voice, her posture, her eyes. The USB drive with Robert's video rested in a padded envelope, tucked securely inside her leather bag, along with the signed transcript Daniel had arranged from a certified stenographer. They weren't going to erase her. Not anymore. Daniel was waiting for her just outside courtroom 6A. He looked up from his phone and nodded. You ready? She nodded. I am. Good. Because we're going to file something bigger than a dismissal. He handed her a folder. We're filing a motion for enforcement of the mediation agreement and a motion for sanctions against Colleen for willfully violating its terms. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Sanctions? It's time she learns there are consequences for trying to bury people in paperwork in bad faith. She didn't just challenge your marriage, she undermined a legally mediated agreement that she signed, and then used that breach to file a lien and intimidate you. That's more than annoying. It's punitive. They entered the courtroom with quiet certainty. Colleen was already seated, her lawyer at her side, this time looking sharper, more prepared. She had anticipated a counterattack. What she hadn't anticipated, Margaret suspected, was just how much truth was about to enter the room. The judge, a woman this time, sharp-eyed and brisk, opened the proceedings. This hearing concerns the post-mediation lien filed against Margaret Stevens and her motion for dismissal and sanctions. Miss Stevens, your counsel may proceed. Daniel stood and walked the court through the timeline: the mediated settlement, the notarized agreement, the sudden lien, the contradiction in filings, and, finally, the introduction of Robert's video message. This is a direct video statement made by Mr. Robert Stevens before his passing, recorded privately and kept in a box labeled for Ms. Stevens. It clearly articulates his intent regarding his marriage and his estate. The transcript is also submitted for the court's records. The judge accepted the USB and transcript, brows furrowed. Has this been verified? Yes, Your Honor. Digital forensics confirmed the video's metadata places the recording approximately 3 months before Mr. Stevens's death. The voice, image, and data are consistent with other verified recordings. The courtroom remained silent as the judge scanned the transcript. Colleen sat motionless, but her eyes flickered. Margaret could tell, she had seen that look before. Rage trying to hide inside shame. When the judge finished reading, she addressed Colleen's side directly. Miss Stevens, she said evenly. Would you like to explain why you filed a lien after agreeing to a mediation that explicitly awarded the property to the respondent? Colleen's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client believed there were ambiguities in the agreement. The judge cut her off. I've read the agreement. There are no ambiguities. There is only defiance. Silence again. Margaret didn't look at Colleen. She didn't need to. The judge continued. I find that the lien was filed in bad faith. I am granting the motion for dismissal. Furthermore, I am awarding attorney's fees to the respondent and issuing a formal sanction of $5,000 to be paid by the petitioner for contempt of the mediated settlement. A quiet gasp from the gallery. Colleen's mouth dropped open. Margaret remained still, her hands gently folded on her lap. Court is adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Daniel turned to her. This is more than a win, he said. This is protection. I don't want revenge, she said softly. I just wanted peace. He nodded. Now you have it. Or at least the start of it. As Margaret walked down the courthouse steps, a rush of wind lifted her hair slightly. The sky was that soft kind of overcast, where the light is even and calm, no glare, no shadow. Just balance. At the bottom of the steps stood Elliot. She didn't ask how he knew to come. He offered her a small smile. I saw the notice in the public records. Margaret smiled back. Want to walk? They wandered toward the park, neither rushing nor speaking for the first few blocks. There was something easy about being near him. He carried his silence well, not as avoidance, but as presence. At a corner bench, he finally said, You've changed. Margaret looked at him. How so? You're not quiet anymore. She smiled, but there was no smugness in it. Just truth. No, she said. I'm not. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. My mom's going to hate me for this. But Grandpa gave me this key years ago. For the tool shed in the backyard. He used to call it his thinking place. Elliot hesitated. There's a second drawer under the floorboard. I didn't tell anyone before. Margaret took the key carefully. Another piece of Robert. Another buried thing rising to the surface. As they sat there, a gentle breeze rustled the nearby trees, carrying the soft scent of cut grass and warm concrete. Life was returning. Not the way it was before, but in a way that felt earned, and Margaret, for the first time in months, felt like she wasn't just defending a memory, she was living again. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn. The house was quiet, but no longer heavy. For the first time since Robert's passing, she didn't feel like a guest in her own home. She made a single cup of black coffee, the way Robert used to take it, and stepped outside with the small brass key Elliot had given her. The shed sat at the edge of the backyard, partially shaded by a row of old maples. It hadn't been opened in months. Ivy had crept up its sides, and the door stuck slightly before giving way with a reluctant groan. Dust floated in streaks of early morning light as she stepped inside. The familiar smell of oil, cedar, and thyme settled around her. Robert's things were still in place, his tools hung in perfect order, work gloves folded neatly on the bench, a cracked stool beside a small drafting table where he used to sketch designs he never quite finished. Margaret's eyes scanned the space until she found it, a loose floorboard beneath the table. She knelt slowly, pried it up, and found a narrow drawer hidden underneath. Inside, a small, locked box, a worn-out composition notebook and envelope. Marked simply, "If they come for her." Her breath caught. She opened the envelope first. Inside was another letter, dated almost a year before Robert's death. "Margaret, if they ever try to take what's yours, our home, your place in it, your peace, this is what I couldn't say in court but wanted you to have in your corner. Inside the box are documents Colleen doesn't know exist. I put her name on a few early accounts years ago, a mistake I regret. I meant to fix it and never did. But I made records. Clear ones. Showing which funds were truly mine, and which were used to build this life with you. They may twist stories, but numbers don't lie. I'm sorry for the silence. I thought I was protecting you from the noise. But now I see, the noise came anyway. And you faced it better than I ever could. Love always, Robert." She opened the locked box next. Inside were meticulously kept bank statements, signed letters to 2 financial advisors revoking Colleen's authority on certain accounts, and a notarized document naming Margaret as the intended beneficiary of the house, a document that never made it into the revised will. Her throat tightened. Not with fear, but with a sharp, almost painful sense of clarity. This wasn't just documentation. It was vindication, proof of intent. Proof that her fight hadn't been selfish or misplaced. Robert had tried to protect her, just too quietly. Too late. She gathered the contents gently, placing them back into the box, and returned to the house, the sunrise beginning to spill across the lawn behind her. That afternoon, she met Daniel in his office and laid everything out across the conference table. He examined the papers in silence, then whistled softly. "This is substantial." "I know," Margaret said. "I just didn't know it existed until now." He flipped through the statements, noting Robert's careful annotations in the margins. "This can lock down your position as the surviving financial partner. Even if Colleen tries to contest again, this ends it. It confirms you are entitled to more than just the house. You were his chosen heir, in everything but final ink." Margaret nodded. "Do I file it?" Daniel leaned back, considering. "We could. Or," he tapped the table thoughtfully, "we can send a copy to her attorney and make it clear that if she files anything else, we'll pursue full litigation, including retroactive inheritance claims." She thought were closed. Margaret smiled faintly. "You mean, finally end it?" Quietly. "Yes," Daniel said. "But permanently." That evening, Margaret sat by the living room window as the sun went down. The world outside moved on. Kids rode their bikes past her gate, a neighbor dragged a hose across the grass, someone was playing the piano in a nearby house, slightly out of tune. The fight wasn't over. But it had changed. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was resolution. She walked to the hallway, where a family photo still hung, one from long before her time. Robert, his late wife, Colleen as a child. Margaret had never felt comfortable near it, never quite sure if she belonged in a house filled with ghosts of other lives, but now, she stepped into the study, retrieved one of their own photos from the drawer, and hung it beside the old one. Not to erase the past, but to complete it. The leaves had begun to turn. Subtle at first, the deep green of summer surrendering to hints of ochre, rust, and amber along the edges. Margaret stood on the porch with a cup of chamomile, the air crisper than the week before. The house, her house, was quiet inside, steady like a well-bound book, and then the doorbell rang. Not a knock this time, the bell. Not the polite kind used by neighbors. The kind people press when they want to be heard. Margaret opened the door and found Colleen, standing alone, her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild weather. No lawyer. No papers. No accusations in hand. Just tired eyes. Margaret didn't step aside. "You're early if you're here to file another claim." "I'm not," Colleen said quietly. Margaret waited. Colleen hesitated, then looked out at the yard. "Elliot told me about the letter. And the shed. And the video." Margaret's expression didn't change. "I didn't know he left anything for you like that," Colleen added. I thought if it was real, he would have told me." Margaret sighed, voice calm but unyielding. "He didn't tell you because he knew how you'd react." Colleen flinched, but didn't argue. "I came here today because," she swallowed, her words catching like they were made of splinters. "I don't want to fight anymore. And I don't want to pretend I didn't know who you were to him." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "You tried to ruin me." "I tried to erase a version of my father I didn't want to believe existed," Colleen said. "You weren't part of the story I understood. You didn't fit the picture I had in my head of how his life was supposed to end." She paused, then added, "But the truth doesn't ask for our permission, does it?" Margaret stepped out onto the porch, crossing her arms. "So, what now? You came to apologize?" Colleen shook her head. "No. I came to tell you I'm letting go. No more filings. No more legal tricks. My attorney is withdrawing everything. I saw the video. I heard him. It's over. Margaret looked at her carefully, weighing every word. What changed your mind? Colleen hesitated. Honestly? It wasn't the documents. Or the threat of being sanctioned again. It was Elliot. He looked at me last week and said, "You're the only one making this ugly." And I realized. I wasn't protecting his legacy. I was poisoning it. She looked down at her hands. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve that. But I wanted to look you in the eye and say I understand now. You were his wife. You didn't steal anything. He gave it to you, his time, his trust, his name. Margaret felt a deep stillness settle inside her. Not peace. Not yet. But the space for it. She nodded once. Thank you for saying that. Colleen turned to leave, but paused. One more thing. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Colleen reached into her bag and pulled out a faded recipe card. He used to make this stew for me when I was little. He said it was his mother's. After the funeral, I looked for it and couldn't find it anywhere. I thought maybe. Margaret took the card, reading the loopy handwriting. He gave it to me a few years ago, she said softly. Told me. It never came out right when he made it without someone to cook with. Colleen gave a weak smile. He was a terrible cook. Margaret chuckled. He really was. They stood for a moment, not as friends, not yet, but as people who had finally stepped out from opposite corners of the same room. Colleen nodded again, turned, and walked down the steps. She didn't look back. Margaret went inside and sat at the kitchen table. She ran her fingers over the recipe card, then placed it gently inside Robert's old planner. Later that evening, she walked the familiar path to the community garden. The sunflowers had bloomed late that year, stubborn and tall. She knelt beside the spot where she'd buried the letter weeks ago. The soil had shifted slightly, not disturbed, just changed. Like it had accepted something into itself and moved forward. She sat quietly beside the plot, eyes closed, listening to the hum of cicadas and distant traffic, and for the first time since Robert's death, she didn't feel like she was clinging to the past. She was resting in it, standing on it, and, finally, moving beyond it. The first true chill of fall arrived in early October. Margaret woke to frost on the lawn, the maple outside the bedroom window aflame in red. She wrapped herself in Robert's old cardigan, still hanging on the hook where he left it, and padded downstairs to start coffee. There was no tension in the silence now. No looming letters. No footsteps echoing from old battles. The legal battles had ended. The lien had been formally discharged. The county records now listed Margaret as sole owner of the property. The bank accounts were closed and redistributed as agreed. The house, once Robert's alone, had become hers in every official, spiritual, and emotional sense, but it wasn't victory that warmed her chest as she stirred sugar into her cup. Was something quieter, steadier, belonging. Later that week, Margaret decided to host a dinner, the first since Robert died. She invited two neighbors she'd known for years but never truly spent time with. Elliot, too, who offered to help her shop for groceries. And Howard, Robert's longtime friend, who brought her a bottle of Cabernet and a jar of his wife's famous fig jam. The evening unfolded slowly. Warm light. Slow jazz humming from the old speaker. Margaret's stew bubbling on the stove, her own version of Robert's mother's recipe, made a little spicier, with fresh thyme and a handful of her own touches. They ate in the dining room. The one she'd always felt a little out of place in, surrounded by portraits of people whose lives she had stepped into late. But that night, she didn't feel like an intruder. The table felt full. Not of noise, but of presence. After dessert, a simple apple tart, Howard raised his glass. To Margaret, he said. For making a house a home, the hard way. They laughed. She did too. After everyone left and the dishes were done, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars hanging low. She wrapped herself in a shawl and sat in the rocker Robert used to favor. The neighborhood had gone quiet. In the stillness, her mind drifted, not to courtrooms or signatures. Not even to Colleen, but to Robert. Not the version of him defined by illness or omission. But the man who once sat beside her on this very porch and read aloud from a mystery novel with terrible accents just to make her laugh. The man who learned to make tea the way she liked, even though he hated tea. The man who left behind pieces of himself, not for control, but for continuity. She remembered something he'd said once, years ago, after a long day spent tending to the garden and fixing a broken cabinet door. You know, the thing about love this late in life is that it doesn't waste time pretending. You don't fall in love with the future, you fall in love with what's right in front of you, and you hold it tight because you know damn well nothing's guaranteed. He hadn't always known how to show it, but in the end, he had, and so had she. Margaret stood slowly and walked back inside. Before heading to bed, she placed a small photo of her and Robert, the one from Vermont, in a frame and set it on the hallway table. Not hidden in a drawer. Not tucked between documents, right where it belonged. The final step wasn't about claiming what she had earned at IT, was about choosing what to carry forward, and what to leave behind. The house no longer echoed. It breathed.